Professor Keth'mal clicked his four mandibles together in what his species considered deep thought, though any human observing would have mistaken it for the sound of an irritated cricket. The Advanced Combat Strategy exam papers lay spread across his desk like battle plans for academic warfare, which, in retrospect, they absolutely were. 17 cycles, he muttered to himself, his compound eyes reflecting the holographic displays of theoretical battlefields. 17 cycles of teaching the finest military minds in the galaxy, and then they send me Deathworlders. The irony wasn't lost on him that the most peaceful-looking species in the Academy had somehow managed to turn every single tactical exercise into what could only be described as a beautiful, organized mayhem. The Zentari had been studying warfare for over 3,000 years, perfecting the art of strategic thinking, creating mathematical models for every possible combat scenario. And then along came humanity, with their bizarre habit of treating warfare like some sort of twisted creative writing exercise. Keth'mal's 6 arms worked independently, each one preparing a different section of what he privately called the impossible exam. 10 scenarios, each more complex than the last, each requiring a specific type of strategic thinking that had taken centuries to develop. Siege warfare, space combat, guerrilla tactics, psychological operations, resource management, technological superiority, numerical disadvantage, environmental warfare, multi-species coordination, and the grand finale, total strategic collapse recovery. Let's see how their precious outside-the-box thinking handles this, he chittered, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had just constructed the perfect mousetrap. Each scenario had been designed with one specific, academically sound solution. There were no creative alternatives, no room for improvisation, no space for whatever it was humans did when they got that peculiar gleam in their eyes. The exam was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and to come to Keth'mal could already imagine the confused silence that would fill the examination hall when the other species realized they were facing scenarios that would challenge even seasoned military commanders. The Krillians would tentacle tap nervously on their desks, the Vorlak would start stress molting, and the Thessians would probably begin their death chants early. But the humans? Oh, the humans would probably do something completely unexpected. Yes, again. Ian. Keth'mal sealed the exam papers in security holofolders, each one requiring his personal biosignature to open. Tomorrow would either validate 3 millennia of Zentari military doctrine, or, well, he preferred not to think about the alternative. Deathworlders, he grumbled, switching off his office lights. What's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, as it turned out. The Grand Examination Hall of Station Nexus Prime had witnessed many things over the centuries. Diplomatic negotiations, interstellar treaty signings, and the occasional food fight between rival species during lunch hour. But nothing quite prepared the ancient walls for what was about to unfold on this particular morning. Professor Keth'mal positioned himself at the observation deck, his compound eyes scanning the sea of nervous alien faces below. The Krillians had arranged themselves in their traditional pre-exam formation, tentacles intertwined in what their species called knowledge-sharing circles, though it looked more like a purple spaghetti nightmare to anyone else. The Vorlak had already begun their stress molting, leaving small piles of shed scales around their desks like metallic confetti. The Thessians sat in perfect silence, their crystalline skin flickering with the light patterns that indicated deep meditation or possibly mild panic. And then there were the humans. 3 of them, scattered throughout the hall like tiny bombs waiting to detonate. Lieutenant Zara Voss sat near the back, casually braiding her hair while reading through the exam materials. Cadet Marcus Webb was in the middle section, apparently using his exam booklet as a fan to cool himself down. And there, in the front row, sat Cadet Yara Blackstone, the one who had single-handedly turned Keth'mal's Introduction to Siege Warfare class into what could only be described as a masterclass in creative destruction. "Begin," Keth'mal announced, his voice echoing through the hall's translation systems in 47 different languages. The effect was immediate and, frankly, hilarious. The Krillians began rapid-fire tentacle calculations, their appendages moving so fast they created small whirlwinds of displaced air. The Vorlak started hyperventilating, which caused their scales to shed even faster, creating what looked like a localized blizzard of anxiety. The Thessians' skin patterns shifted from calm blue to alarmed orange faster than a traffic light malfunction. And the humans? They were reading? Just reading. Like they were perusing a particularly interesting menu at a restaurant they'd never tried before. Keth'mal focused his attention on Yara Blackstone, the human who had somehow managed to turn his carefully constructed unwinnable Scenario 7 into a decisive victory by suggesting they just ask the enemy really nicely if they wanted to surrender first. The memory still made his mandibles twitch. She was reading Scenario 1, something about a three-front assault on a heavily fortified position with limited resources and no air support. The kind of problem that had stumped military theorists for generations. Her reaction? She chuckled. Actually chuckled, like someone had just told her a mildly amusing joke about her grandmother's cooking. Meanwhile, Cadet Webb had apparently finished reading all 10 scenarios and was now doodling what appeared to be a cartoon representation of a Krillian trying to eat soup with tentacles. The accuracy was disturbing. 20 minutes into the exam, the first signs of academic carnage began to show. A Thessian in the third row had started flickering between 16 different colors simultaneously, creating what could only be described as a rainbow seizure. 2 Vorlak had completely molted their outer shells and were now sitting in what looked like metallic puddles of their former selves. The Krillians had given up on individual thinking and had formed one massive tentacle brain that was probably violating several exam regulations. But Yara Blackstone? She was writing. Steadily, calmly, occasionally pausing to stretch her neck or crack her knuckles. At one point she actually smiled and wrote something that made her shoulders shake with suppressed laughter. Keth'mal felt a familiar chill run down his exoskeleton. It was the same feeling he'd experienced when watching humans approach impossible problems. The feeling that somewhere, somehow, the fundamental laws of military strategy were about to be violated in ways that would make theoretical physicists weep. 4 hours later, as the other species stumbled out of the exam hall looking like survivors of a natural disaster, the humans simply stood up, handed in their papers, and walked out chatting about lunch plans. Keth'mal stared at the exam papers in his hands, particularly the one marked Y. Blackstone in neat, human handwriting. He had a terrible feeling that his carefully constructed academic world was about to collapse. That evening, Professor Keth'mal settled into his office with a steaming cup of fermented beetle juice and the stack of exam papers that would determine the final grades for advanced combat strategy. He had arranged them in alphabetical order by species, saving the human papers for last. A reward for getting through the predictable responses, he told himself, or perhaps he was just delaying the inevitable. The Krillian papers were, as expected, masterpieces of tentacle-scribed military orthodoxy. Cadet Yara had provided textbook solutions to all 10 scenarios, complete with mathematical proofs and references to classical tactical theorems. His siege warfare solution involved a 47-step process that would have made ancient Zenthari generals weep with pride. Perfect, boring, absolutely mind-numbingly correct. The Vorlak submissions were similarly predictable. Cadet Mordek had approached each scenario with the methodical precision of his species, outlining resource allocation charts, supply chain logistics, and environmental impact assessments. His handwriting was so neat it looked like it had been carved by precision lasers. Each solution followed established military doctrine to the letter, with appropriate citations and footnotes. The Thessian papers sparkled with crystalline logic. Cadet Yara had structured her answers like philosophical treatises, exploring the deeper meaning of warfare while providing solutions that would have earned approving nods from the military academy's most distinguished professors. Her approach to the multi-species coordination scenario was particularly elegant, involving a complex system of light-based communication that only Thessians could fully appreciate. Keth'mal nodded approvingly as he graded each paper. This was how military examinations were supposed to work. Students learned established doctrine, applied it correctly, and received grades that reflected their understanding of centuries of strategic wisdom. Simple, orderly, logical. Then he opened Yara Blackstone's paper. The first scenario, the three-front assault on a fortified position, should have been answered with a careful analysis of force distribution and siege tactics. Instead, Yara had written, send a small team to infiltrate the enemy base 3 days before the attack. Have them reprogram the automated defense systems to play circus music instead of alarm sounds. When the real assault begins, everyone will be too confused and embarrassed to fight effectively. Keth'mal blinked all 17 of his eyes in rapid succession. He read it again, then a third time. The solution was actually tactically sound, psychological warfare combined with electronic sabotage. But circus music? Who thinks of circus music as a weapon? Scenario 2 was worse. The space combat problem, involving outnumbered ships and limited ammunition, had been solved with, it convinced the enemy that your ships are carrying a highly contagious disease that only affects their species. Most alien commanders would rather retreat than risk their crew getting space chickenpox. Whatever equivalent makes them itch uncontrollably. By Scenario 3, Keth'mal's mandibles were clicking uncontrollably. Yara had suggested solving a guerrilla warfare problem by teaching the local wildlife to steal enemy equipment while they sleep. She had included detailed notes about which animals would be most effective at theft, ranking them by stealth capabilities and opposable digits. Scenario 4 involved pretending to be a diplomatic envoy, then challenging the enemy commander to single combat for honor reasons while secretly having your army surround the meeting location. Scenario 5 suggested using holographic projectors to make your small force appear 10 times larger, specifically recommending the projection of really angry-looking mythological creatures that probably don't exist but look scary anyway. Keth'mal's hands were shaking as he read Scenario 6. Environmental warfare solved by accidentally introducing Earth's most annoying invasive species to the enemy's home planet, it specifically mentioning something called Canadian geese. That apparently were nature's own psychological warfare agents. Scenario 7 had him reaching for his emergency anxiety medication. Yara had proposed solving numerical disadvantage by convincing the enemy that fighting humans is considered extremely bad luck in 17 different galactic cultures, and that anyone who attacks us will be cursed with ingrown toenails for 7 generations. Scenario 8 made him question his life choices. She had written an entire paragraph about using reverse psychology to trick the enemy into defeating themselves by telling them they were probably too scared to attack anyway, which would apparently make them so angry they would make tactical mistakes. And then came Scenario 9, where a detailed strategic analysis should have been. There was instead a crude drawing of a skull. Not even a good drawing. It looked like something a human child might scribble with a broken crayon. Below it, in the same neat handwriting that had described weaponizing geese, were the words, intimidation factor. Sometimes the threat of violence is more effective than actual violence. Also, skulls are universally scary. Keth'mal stared at the drawing for a full minute. His left eye started twitching. Finally, with trembling hands, he turned to Scenario 10, the ultimate test, total strategic collapse recovery. The scenario that had no solution, designed to see how students would handle impossible odds. Yara's answer was a single sentence, sir. If the first 9 strategies don't work, you're probably dead anyway, so this question is irrelevant. Keth'mal set down the paper very carefully. He looked at his Beetlejuice, then at the paper, then at the portrait of his grandfather who had founded the Academy's military theory department. Then he put his head in all 6 of his hands and made a sound that his species reserved for moments of complete existential crisis. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear human laughter echoing through the dormitory halls. The emergency faculty meeting was called for 0800 hours the next morning, which meant Admiral Torvik had spent the entire night reading exam papers and probably consuming whatever passed for alcohol in Krillian physiology. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy as professors from 17 different species gathered around the holographic table, each one looking like they had survived some sort of academic natural disaster. Colleagues, Admiral Torvik began, his tentacles writhing in what Keth'mal recognized as barely controlled panic. "We need to discuss the human problem." Professor Keth'mal straightened his thorax indignantly. "There is no human problem, Admiral. There is a problem with humans refusing to follow established military doctrine, but that can be corrected through proper educational." Keth'mal interrupted Dr. Yara from the astrophysics department, her feathers ruffled to the point where she looked like an angry rainbow. "One of your humans solved my impossible navigation scenario by suggesting we just ask the black hole nicely if it could stop being so grabby." "That's not," Keth'mal began. "And it worked." Yara squawked. "The simulation showed a 73% success rate. How does asking a celestial body to be polite result in successful navigation?" Professor Grimtalk from engineering slammed his rocky fist on the table, causing several smaller professors to bounce in their seats. "Don't get me started on humans and engineering. I assigned a project to design a more efficient plasma conduit. The human Marcus Webb submitted blueprints for what he called a really fancy garden hose with attitude. When we built it, it was 400% more efficient than our current systems. Impossible." Keth'mal clicked his mandibles. "Military strategy is based on mathematical principles, proven methodologies, centuries of." Keth'mal. Admiral Torvek's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "I've been reviewing the tactical reports from the last 6 months. Every single training exercise involving humans has ended with results that our computers classify as impossible but successful. They're not just thinking outside the box. They're taking the box, setting it on fire, and then using the ashes to draw victory diagrams." Dr. Silandra from the psychology department leaned forward, her 4 eyes blinking in sequence. "I've been studying human behavior patterns for 2 cycles now. Their approach to problem solving appears to involve a process they call winging it, which roughly translates to making things up as you go along with unreasonable confidence. But that's not how warfare works." Keth'mal protested. "You can't just make up tactics. There are rules, protocols, established procedures that have been tested over millennia." "Tell that to Cadet Voss," grumbled Professor Keth'mal from the communications department. "I assigned her to establish contact with a newly discovered species. Instead of following the 47-step first contact protocol, she sent them a picture of a small earth animal called a cat with the message, 'This is Fluffy. We like fluffy things.' Do you like fluffy things?" They responded by sending their entire diplomatic corps. The room fell silent except for the sound of Keth'mal's mandibles clicking rapidly, like an angry typewriter. "And there's another thing," Admiral Torvek continued, his tentacles now forming what could only be described as distress knots. "I've been analyzing human military history from their home planet. Their most famous victories involve strategies that violate every principle of logical warfare. They once won a major battle by hiding inside a giant wooden horse. Colleagues. They convinced their enemies to drag their entire army inside the city walls because it looked like a nice decoration." "Preposterous," Keth'mal muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "They have a military leader who won battles by crossing a river when everyone said it was impossible," Torvek went on. "Another who defeated a superior force by pretending to retreat, then attacking during a holiday celebration. They have an entire category of warfare they call dirty fighting, which appears to involve doing exactly what your opponent doesn't expect, usually at the worst possible moment." Dr. Yara ruffled her feathers again. "I heard that one of their generals once said, 'No plan survives contact with the enemy,' and they consider this to be wisdom, not a failure of planning." But that makes no sense," Keth'mal stammered. "If your plans don't work, you make better plans. You don't just improvise." Apparently, Admiral Torvek said grimly, humans have turned improvisation into an art form, and they're teaching it to our other students. The room erupted in a cacophony of alien voices, all sharing their own horror stories of human-influenced chaos. Through it all, Keth'mal sat in stunned silence, his worldview crumbling like a cookie in a supernova. But outside the conference room, the sound of human laughter echoed through the halls once again. Enough, Admiral Torvik declared, his tentacles forming what looked like a very uncomfortable pretzel. We're going to test these strategies in simulation. Right now. Today. Before I lose what's left of my sanity. And that's how Professor Keth'mal found himself strapped into the Academy's most advanced tactical simulation chamber, facing off against strategies that had been written by someone who apparently considered warfare to be a form of performance art. The simulation room hummed with the power of quantum processors capable of modeling entire star systems, and Keth'mal was about to use all that computational power to test whether circus music could actually win wars. Simulation parameters set, announced the AI in its perfectly modulated voice. Scenario 1, 3-front assault on fortified position. Professor Keth'mal commanding defending forces. A. Cadet Blackstone's strategy will be implemented by simulation protocols. Keth'mal straightened in his command chair, his 6 arms dancing across holographic controls. This was his element. 17 cycles of military experience, backed by 3,000 years of Zenthari tactical evolution. He positioned his forces according to time-tested defensive strategies, created overlapping fields of fire, established communication networks, and prepared for a siege that would showcase the superiority of proper military thinking. Initiating strategy, infiltration team deploying 3 days prior to assault, the AI announced. Keth'mal watched with growing confusion as a small team of simulated humans appeared on his sensors, was sneaking through his defenses like they were playing some sort of elaborate game of hide and seek. His security systems detected them multiple times, but somehow they kept slipping through gaps that shouldn't have existed according to standard infiltration protocols. The infiltration team has accessed Central Defense Network, the AI continued, reprogramming defensive systems to play circus music instead of alarm sounds. That's not possible, Keth'mal muttered, watching his beautifully coordinated defense grid suddenly start broadcasting what could only be described as the most annoying musical arrangement in galactic history. Security protocols prevent unauthorized access to. Alert sounds have been replaced with Carnival of the Animals performed by the Terran Clown College Orchestra. The AI reported with what sounded suspiciously like electronic bewilderment. The main assault began, and Keth'mal watched in horror as his perfectly trained defenders became increasingly confused by the ridiculous music blaring from their own speakers. Instead of coordinated defensive fire, his troops were stumbling around trying to figure out why their base sounded like a demented birthday party. The attacking force swept through his defenses like they were made of tissue paper and wishful thinking. Simulation complete. Defensive failure. Victory achieved through musical psychological warfare, the AI announced, its voice glitching slightly on the word musical. Next scenario, Admiral Torvik commanded before Keth'mal could protest. Scenario 2, Space Combat Engagement, Outnumbered Fleet Action. This time, Keth'mal was ready. Space combat was pure mathematics, physics, and tactical positioning. There was no room for human nonsense in the cold equations of orbital mechanics and energy weapons. He deployed his superior fleet in a perfect formation, established overlapping fire patterns, and prepared to demonstrate why numbers and firepower always won in space combat. Initiating strategy, broadcasting disease warning to enemy fleet, the AI announced. Keth'mal watched in disbelief as his simulation began receiving frantic communications from his own ships. The enemy had sent a message claiming their vessels were infected with something called Terran itching syndrome, which supposedly caused uncontrollable scratching in 17 different alien species. His crew was demanding immediate medical evacuation, hazmat protocols, and permission to retreat to a safe distance. Fleet morale declining rapidly, the AI reported. Crew requesting immediate withdrawal to avoid infection with space chickenpox. Space chickenpox isn't real. Keth'mal screamed at his holographic fleet, but it was too late. His ships were already retreating, leaving him alone in space with an enemy that had won a battle by claiming to be contagious. Simulation complete. Fleet withdrawal successful. Victory achieved through fictional medical threats. By the third scenario, Keth'mal's eye twitching had evolved into a full-body tremor. The guerrilla warfare simulation had ended with his forces being systematically robbed by wildlife that had somehow been trained to steal military equipment. His supply lines were being disrupted by what the AI kept referring to as tactically enhanced squirrels. "How?" he gasped. "How do you train squirrels for military operations?" According to the strategy notes, the AI replied, "You offer them nuts in exchange for shiny objects." Apparently, most military equipment is sufficiently shiny. Scenario 4 was worse. His diplomatic meeting had ended with him being challenged to single combat by a human who claimed it was for honor reasons, while his entire army was being surrounded by forces that materialized from what his sensors insisted was empty space. The human strategy notes indicated this was called aggressive multitasking. By Scenario 5, the simulation's holographic projectors were displaying what appeared to be a herd of fire-breathing dragons attacking his position. His troops were retreating from creatures that didn't exist, while being defeated by an enemy force that was 1/10 their size. "These aren't dragons," Keth'mal whimpered to the AI. "Dragons aren't real. Why are my troops afraid of things that don't exist?" According to human psychological warfare theory, the AI replied, "It doesn't matter if the threat is real, only if it's scary enough." Also, the strategy notes indicate that humans believe everything is more intimidating when it's on fire. Scenario 6 introduced him to Canadian geese. Keth'mal had never heard of Canadian geese before today. But after watching them systematically destroy his home planet's ecosystem while honking aggressively at his defense forces, he never wanted to hear about them again. "Geese are not a military unit," he protested. "The simulation parameters indicate otherwise," the AI replied. "Canadian geese are classified as nature's own psychological warfare agents and are apparently capable of inducing surrender through sustained aggressive honking." By Scenario 7, Keth'mal was having full conversations with imaginary enemies who kept calling him names until he made tactically unsound decisions out of spite. By Scenario 8, he was experiencing what the AI called reverse psychology cascade failure, where his own strategic thinking was being turned against him by an enemy that kept suggesting he was probably too scared to attack anyway. "I'm not scared," he shouted at the holographic battlefield. "I'm a trained military strategist. I don't make decisions based on playground taunts," but somehow he was, and somehow it was working. When the final simulation ended, Keth'mal sat in stunned silence, staring at a tactical display that showed complete strategic failure across 9 different scenarios. His mandibles had stopped clicking. His eyes had stopped twitching. He had achieved a state of shock so profound that his nervous system had apparently given up trying to process what had just happened. "Well," Admiral Torvik said quietly, "I think we have our answer." The AI's voice cut through the silence. Simulation analysis complete. Human strategies show 89% effectiveness rate. Recommend immediate integration into standard military curriculum. Also recommend psychological counseling for all opposing commanders. Keth'mal made a sound that wasn't quite a word, wasn't quite a scream, and definitely wasn't in any language recognized by the universal translator. The post-simulation analysis took exactly 17 minutes and 43 seconds to complete, which was approximately 17 minutes and 42 seconds longer than it took for Keth'mal's entire understanding of military strategy to collapse into a pile of confused mandible clicks. Final analysis confirms human tactical approaches achieve 78% higher success rates than conventional strategies. The AI announced with what Keth'mal was now convinced was deliberate smugness. Recommend immediate curriculum revision. Also recommend sedatives for Professor Keth'mal. Admiral Torvik's tentacles had formed what could only be described as a complex knot of existential dread. 78%. 78% higher than methods we've been perfecting for 3 millennia. "It's impossible," Keth'mal whispered, staring at the holographic data displays that showed his complete and utter tactical destruction. "Warfare is a science. It follows rules. It has structure. You can't just make it up as you go along." "Actually," came a cheerful voice from the observation deck, "you totally can." Everyone turned to see Cadet Yara Blackstone leaning against the doorframe. looking like someone who had just finished a pleasant lunch rather than someone whose exam answers had broken several professors' minds and possibly violated the laws of physics. Cadet Blackstone, Admiral Torvek's voice carried the careful tone of someone addressing a potentially dangerous explosive device. Perhaps you could explain how your strategies achieved such unprecedented results. Yara shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both modesty and the complete dismissal of 3,000 years of military theory. Oh, that. We've been holding back, sir. Didn't want to seem rude or anything. The silence that followed was so profound that the station's background hum seemed deafening. Holding back? Keth'mal's voice cracked like an adolescent Zenthari going through molting season. Well, yeah, Yara said, settling into a chair with the casual confidence of someone who had just admitted to casually rewriting the fundamental principles of galactic warfare. I mean, you guys have been doing this whole military thing for ages, right? It seemed kind of impolite to just show up and start suggesting that maybe you were overthinking things. Overthinking, Admiral Torvek repeated slowly. Military strategy. Overthinking. Look, Yara continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was causing several professors to question their life choices. Most problems have pretty simple solutions if you're willing to ignore the rules that say you can't solve them that way. Take Scenario 9, for example. Keth'mal's eye twitching returned with a vengeance. The skull. You drew a skull instead of providing a tactical analysis. Exactly. Yara beamed like a student who had just solved a particularly tricky math problem. See, the thing about psychological warfare is that it works best when people don't expect it. Everyone's expecting complicated battle plans and strategic maneuvers, right? But nobody expects a skull drawn in crayon. It's so weird that it gets stuck in their heads. Stuck in their heads, Dr. Silandra from psychology muttered, frantically taking notes. The primitive symbol bypasses logical analysis and directly triggers primal fear responses. It's actually brilliant. Plus, Yara added with a grin that could only be described as mildly terrifying, it takes like 5 seconds to draw a skull, but it takes the enemy hours to figure out what it means. Maximum psychological impact for minimum effort. That's just good time management. Keth'mal slowly lowered his head to the table and began making the soft clicking sounds that his species used for mourning. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized he was mourning the death of everything he thought he knew about military strategy. The worst part, Admiral Torvek said quietly, is that it makes perfect sense. Oh, and sir? Yara added cheerfully. That was us being polite. You should see what we do when we're actually trying. The room fell silent except for the sound of Professor Keth'mal quietly having what could only be described as an academic nervous breakdown. Outside, through the reinforced walls of the academy, the sound of human laughter echoed across the stars. 6 months later, Professor Keth'mal stood before a classroom full of eager alien faces, holding a curriculum guide that made his mandibles ache just looking at it. The official title read Advanced Human Unconventional Warfare Tactics, but everyone called it How to Think Like a Deathworlder 101. Today, he announced with the enthusiasm of someone reading their own execution warrant, we'll be studying Chapter 7, Why Rules Are More Like Guidelines, and Guidelines Are More Like Suggestions. A Krillian tentacle shot up immediately. Professor, I don't understand how suggesting the enemy take a chill pill constitutes a valid negotiation strategy. Keth'mal sighed deeply, a sound that had become his signature expression over the past several months. According to human tactical theory, aggressive relaxation can confuse opponents who expect formal diplomatic protocols. Apparently, telling someone to chill while pointing weapons at them creates cognitive dissonance that he stopped, realizing he was actually starting to understand it. The door chimed, and Admiral Torvek entered with a stack of papers. Professor, the new standardized exams have arrived. Keth'mal accepted the papers with trembling hands, knowing what he would find. Sure enough, every single question now ended with the same addendum: provide the conventional solution, then explain how a human would solve this problem. Question 10 made him want to retire to a nice, quiet planet where warfare was conducted with strongly worded letters and passive-aggressive poetry. It read, "Your forces are completely surrounded, outnumbered 50-1, and have no hope of survival." How would a human turn this into a victory? He looked at his desk, where his resignation letter sat unfinished for the third time this month. The opening line read, "Dear Admiral Torvik, I can no longer teach military strategy to beings who consider winging it to be a fundamental tactical principle." But every time he tried to finish it, he remembered the simulation results. 78% more effective. The numbers didn't lie, even when they made him question reality. From the hallway came the sound of Cadet Blackstone explaining to a group of younger students why asking nicely but carrying a really big stick was superior to traditional intimidation tactics. Keth'mal clicked his mandibles once, picked up his stylus, and began grading papers that would probably give him nightmares for the rest of his academic career. After all, someone had to teach the next generation how to wage war like humans, even if it killed him, which, statistically speaking, it probably would.